So, hi everyone. Thanks for coming today. Appreciate your attendance. Very excited to be here myself, Georgia Tech, and speaking to the folks from the Institute for People and Technology. When they asked me to come and talk and speak about the human edge of the Internet of Things, I thought it was an interesting opportunity to take this large, enormous concept that we're all wrestling with and really bring it down to a level that we could wrap our heads around a little bit, giving some examples and looking a bit at how it impacts our day-to-day life. So a bit about me, beyond the wonderful intro I got from Jeff, which I paid him handsomely for. IHS is a global company that most of you have never heard of. We have about 8,000 folks working in 30 countries globally. Most people know IHS CERA, which does a lot of oil and gas and energy research, or IHS Global Insight, which does a lot of global economic analysis, or IHS Change Defense, which does a lot of work with the military and resources and information resources for them. IHS Technology, which I'm a part of, is about 900 analysts, again, working globally, looking at everything from every piece of the electronic supply chain, so everything from the silicon at one end to the electronic components at the other end. I head up a group that is looking specifically at digital identification and security, which is pretty key to what we'll be talking about for IoT, as well as machine-to-machine communication. And then I have the pleasure of working with about 30 research groups across all of IHS, pulling together information, aggregating data, and looking at what this looks like from an IoT standpoint. So having now thrown the Internet of Things and IoT around several times, I wanted to talk a little bit about what exactly is the Internet of Things, because you can ask 10 people and get 9 different definitions. 2 of them will know each other. So, IoT really is a conceptual framework. What we're talking about is enabling connectivity in devices, enabling embedded intelligence in devices, and the idea is that these devices, which may be connected today, or many of them are not connected today, can then add value to your daily life. So the best example for this, the easiest example for this of most people is their smartphone that's sitting in their pocket, all the things it allows you to do today that you couldn't do 10 years ago. Extrapolating that forward and looking at, okay, if we add that same level of intelligence into our homes, into our cars, into industrial equipment, what does that mean for us, for society as a whole? What's the value add there for all of us as a whole? So IoT can be used to provide unique value propositions, and I'll mention that a couple of times in my talk, and how we can take something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So looking at IoT, Internet of Things, as a concept, the idea is that it enables dynamic interactions. The basis for that, though, are internet-connected devices, and this is where we spend a lot of our time, is looking at the ability to take the lessons that we've learned over the last few years in smartphones and in other areas as well, to take embedded processing, very small, very power efficient, and embed that intelligence in a wide range of devices which are electronic today but not connected, and then eventually into devices which aren't connected or electronic, things like chairs in this auditorium so we could see who's attending and who's awake. The idea is that integrating sensors and telemetry, integrating communications technology will give us the ability to do that. And again, a lot of this is a benefit of lessons that have been learned in smartphones and other consumer electronics devices, but we're now taking that lesson and applying it to industrial. Internet of Things is not about one technology at all. It's about a whole host of technologies working together. So obviously AT&T and Verizon and Vodafone, you'll hear them talk about Internet of Things a lot. They have a lot of interest in it. Makes perfect sense. Everyone has a smartphone today, or most of us have a smartphone today. What they're interested in seeing is what else can be cellular enabled moving forward. Mobile applications, cars, make perfect sense. There's other devices that are remote, make perfect sense. But it's not all going to be about cellular. A lot of it's going to be about low power wireless technologies, networking together. Again, if you were going to wire, for example, the seats in this room, cellular doesn't make sense. You wouldn't want to have a cellular chipset in each of these chairs, but a Zigbee network or a mesh low power wireless network makes perfect sense. From a market segmentation standpoint, and market segmentation is just fancy analyst talk for this is how we break up the market. We've got nodes that are at the edge of the network. Many of you are familiar with this concept. We're looking at things like the Nest thermostat, for example. We're looking at things like streetlights, CCTV security cameras, washers and dryers. These are things that are going to have limited intelligence, limited user interface in particular. Mostly they're going to collect information and pass that information back along. And there's a host of information they can collect. Then you've got infrastructure devices, and this is where your players like your Cisco and SAP and Oracle come into play, passing that information around, collecting that data, storing that data, making it available to other devices. And then you've got your controller devices, which are what we use in our day-to-day life. They have a complex user interface, and we can use those to interface with the Internet of Things. So that's going to be the human point where we are able to connect to these devices and see what kind of data they're providing. Honestly, this is a handful of applications. I could have filled this slide with 50 pictures, but it seemed a little busy. So I tried to really zero in on a few areas where Internet of Things is taking off today, where it's making an impact today. Connected car, you're going to be hearing more and more about in the next 12 to 18 months. There's a big, significant effort going on in there. Telecommunications, obviously. Home and building automation is an area where we're seeing a lot of impact today. Data center and cloud is a key component. Consumer devices, obviously, industrial increasingly, and industrial's a broad area. It's not something that most people have direct impact with, but it touches your life in a host of different ways, in a variety of different ways, because it has everything to do with how the goods and equipment that you use in your day-to-day life are made. It has to do with how your furniture is made, your house is built, your food is grown. So industrial is pretty far-reaching, and to date, while it is very interested in the Internet of Things as a concept and connectivity as a concept, we haven't seen a lot of, we're just starting to see it take off in that space. And then medical and commercial transportation. So how is Internet of Things evolving? What does it mean for us, for you as folks? What's the big picture idea behind it? So we've got Internet of Things evolution, and then I talk about Internet of Everything. And you'll hear companies like Cisco and Qualcomm talk about Internet of Everything now. That's the new term that we're starting to evolve into. Really where we start, the foundation for all of this is connecting devices, adding connectivity and intelligence like I talked about. Second piece of this is being able to collect data from those devices, whether it's position, whether it's atmospheric information, whether it is motion and position. All of that data is stored and then can be made accessible to other devices. And that's really the stage of this. If you want to look at this as an evolutionary chain, that's really where we are today. We're doing the connections to the devices, we're collecting the data, and we're starting to devise different ways to use it. But it's all very siloed use cases. It's all in very specific example-specific cases. Car telematics is a good example. You'll have a great navigation app. In some cases, we're just starting to see the car manufacturers enable connectivity in the vehicles, and what they're trying to do is collect vehicle data so they can see, okay, is it performing the way we expected? Is there something we need to notify the driver of? For insurance telematics, another new area coming out for cars just starting out. They're monitoring driver information, looking at your driving habits so they can charge you an appropriate rate for your insurance. Very specific use cases. When you start talking about integrating all of that, that's a whole different story, and we haven't seen that happen yet. But that's going to be enabled, we think, through open APIs to allow complex analytics and big data. Where that starts to get into play is when you start to get into a concept like smart cities, which is a much bigger and longer conversation, so I'll just touch on it briefly here. But that's when we start talking about taking connected cars, taking emergency responder systems, taking traffic control systems and tolling systems within a large city like Atlanta or like Austin, where I'm from, and being able to integrate all of that data so that you can actively manage the traffic situation for day-to-day life, to make a better life for the commuters in that city, to manage large sporting events, or heaven forbid, a large disaster. You can manage traffic and first responders in real time. But that requires an integration of data and access to data from multiple disparate systems, which is very complex and not easy to do. It also requires a lot of security. The other key piece here is that it requires people to be comfortable with sharing that data. And even today, we're seeing that's emerging as a big challenge. Folks are already starting to get uncomfortable with the amount of data they're sharing on their smartphone. We've certainly seen some very good examples of that very recently, unfortunately, and how much that information can be tracked, how much that information, when it's combined using the same big data and analytics techniques, can be used to provide a profile of people. So now when you start saying, well, okay, so now I'm going to add my connected car into the mix and potentially my connected home into the mix, that starts to create a pretty robust picture of who I am as a person. Without me necessarily signing off on the dotted line for any of that. So driving consumer acceptance of this, educating the consumer, and making sure that we're implementing systems in a responsible way, in a secure way, is absolutely critical to the growth of a larger Internet of Things concept. It's not something that we can just, because we can solve the problem with technology, it doesn't mean that we can get people to use it. That's a key thing. What we've seen in the technology industry over the last 15 years that I've been in the technology industry, and I'm sure some of our other speakers have been there even longer, we can solve virtually any problem with technology. We have very bright people. We have a will to do it. We can find a way to solve most technology problems. The biggest issue is making sure that what we do is done in a responsible way, and it's done in a way that actually improves people's lives. So, unique value, realizing the true value of a connected society. Again, using smart cities as an example, for me, in an Internet of Everything type of scenario, now you're not just looking at connected parking meters, which are providing a benefit potentially to the city, potentially to the users, but primarily to the person who owns the parking space and who's paying for the meter. But it's integrating that parking meter information with the traffic control systems, with the tolling systems, with the local business owners, so that their employee can drive in, find a space, and get to work on time. And doing it in a convenient, easy-to-use fashion where the consumer really can opt in a true sense, opt in and be comfortable with the fact that their data is anonymized if it is being used for larger analytics around traffic patterns in the city. So here's the big number slide. Everybody's got a big number slide. This one's mine. Main difference with mine is I will tell you, I'll come back in 2025 and I will show you my number was right. So that's my pitch. We're looking, our estimate is 49.8 billion connected devices in 2025. It's not going to be 49.7. It's going to be exactly 49.8. And that's a mix of all of these different markets you see: automotive, computers, medical, fixed and mobile comms, consumer devices, military and aerospace, the whole gamut. Industrial, which is the tan segment, which those of you with very good eyesight can see, is going to be the largest. That's where we expect to see significant growth over the next few years. And that's everything from power and energy to smart grid to factory automation. Industrial covers a multitude of areas. The reason we run the forecast out to 2025 is because we think it's going to take that long, 1, to figure out the business models, 2, to figure out consumer acceptance, 3, to get the systems integration in place to take advantage of it. So there are significant hurdles that we're going to need to overcome over the next few years. This isn't tomorrow we'll flip a switch and the Internet of Things will be on and everyone will have a better life, although we'd like to think that'll be the case. It's much more likely that right now what we're doing, as I said, is laying a foundation, and we need to build on that in an intelligent fashion. And that's what I think the folks in this room will be able to help us to do. That's one of the reasons I was excited to come here today, is because I think it's going to take a partnership of folks from different pieces of industry, working with folks from cities and municipalities and government to figure out the regulatory piece of this, working with folks from education so we can figure out, okay, what are the new and emerging technologies that we can integrate into this to make it all tie together. So it's not a problem any one group can solve by themselves. It's not a wireless chipset problem that we can solve. It's not a cellular or broadband carrier problem that they can come up with a pricing plan and that will solve. It's going to require all of that being integrated. So what do we think is driving and enabling this? IPv6 implementation, obviously pretty critical when you start talking 50 billion devices. LTE and fiber, enabling all of that data when you start looking at all the different traffic and network traffic that's being created by these devices. So if you take something like streetlights, for example, which increasingly we start hearing in the conversation around Internet of Things, there's an immediate short-term benefit to enabling intelligence in a streetlight, because then they don't have to roll a truck out to check and see if the bulb is out, or wait for a neighbor to call in and say, hey, the light bulb's out on the corner of 5th and Main. What they can do is, as soon as it goes out, they know, and they can send a truck out specifically to replace the bulb. But if you've got the connectivity and the intelligence at that mast, what else can you do with that? What other sensors can you build in with that to give you local weather conditions? There's potentially some value there. Impression and improved backhaul and data centers. Expanding the capacity basically is a whole big section. When you start talking 50 billion connected devices, you need to expand every part of the pipe. Ultra-low power processors are massive, and we've seen conversations with folks who are talking about essentially disposable radios. I mean, getting to the point where literally you could have greeting cards that have very low power radios in them. That will be able to integrate with a smartphone or with a laptop or with the internet, so you can give very targeted content. Then the third piece really is market penetration. This is one of those areas where we think, as the installed base of connected devices hits a tipping point, that's just going to drive more interest in connected devices. In a large way, much like smartphones did. As soon as one person had a smartphone, then they wanted to connect to all of their friends on smartphones, be able to message them instantaneously, being able to check in on their kids instantaneously, being able to post to Facebook instantaneously. There's kind of that critical threshold that you hit where it's like, okay, well, it's great that my house is connected. Why isn't my office connected? What's the next step there? Challenges and restraints, and I won't spend a huge amount of time on any one of these, so we can jump into the next bit. But global economy, honestly, if we start talking about concepts like smart cities and larger implementations for IoT, that requires significant investment, and not all of that investment is going to come from the private sector. We do see global economy being an issue, particularly around new home builds and new office buildings going up, because that's where a lot of the new home automation and building automation systems would come into play. Business models, and this is a huge issue, is how do we make money on it? And how do we make money for ourselves, but how do we also enable an ecosystem where we can share that data and everyone has a stake in that, an interest in sharing their information? Because it is the shared information that's going to make this greater than the sum of its parts. So we see business models and figuring out what the business models are for all of these different areas, because IoT is so vast. The business model that works for commercial building automation may not work for retail buildings. It may not work for a home office. And those are going to be completely separate from what's worked out for healthcare, which is a whole mess in and of itself. So all of those different business models, when you're talking about a concept as vast as IoT, it's a significant issue and one that we have to give some serious thought to. And then security and privacy, and this is, as I mentioned before, it's a massive issue. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I know we have a panel coming up next that's going to get into a lot more detail on it. But security and privacy for consumers as well as for businesses. When you start talking about businesses being able to share information back and forth to improve efficiency, there's also the potential that they're exposing themselves or sharing information with possible competitors, which is going to be a concern. So this will be the last piece on the pure IoT, and then we'll talk about wearable tech and humans and how humans fit into the grand scheme of this. But we do see cloud being a key enabler for this. And cloud, big data, IoT are all interrelated concepts. You can view each of them individually from a pure IT framework standpoint, but when you're really talking about IoT, you need to look at cloud as an enabler. You need to look at big data and analytics as an enabler, because you're going to have applications, devices, and sensors all being integrated through this. And as you can see, they're going to touch every single one of those areas. So human interface and wearable tech, which is one of the things I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about over the next day and a half, particularly with the gentleman from Google Glass coming to talk to you. Internet of Things does include people. And wearable tech is kind of on the front edge of that now. So it's one thing to think of it as being it's about a chair, it's about a light switch, it's about an electric meter, but it's also about you and knowing where you are at a given point in time, giving you the ability to interact with all of those other devices in your environment in real time. And that's where wearable tech comes in. So while smartphones have been an enabler for it, the applications for wearable technology are vast and encompass everything from military and defense applications, healthcare applications, sports and fitness, all the ones that I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with. We have a fancy graphic that looks pretty that kind of highlights that for you. There's a lot of overlap in these different areas. Smart glasses fit in virtually every category, whether it's from infotainment to military to healthcare and medical. Each one of these has the potential to change people's lives. What we look at to determine, okay, what is wearable technology? How do we define wearable technology? One, can it be worn for a long period of time? Two, is it smart? Does it have advanced circuitry? Does it have embedded processing capabilities at some level? Does it have connectivity at some level? Maybe short-range connectivity where it's talking to a watch or a smartphone, or it may have broader connectivity where it's on Wi-Fi and it's talking with other devices in your house or office. So again, here's fancy number slide, looking at $8.6 billion in OEM revenue for 2012. So that's just device manufacturers who are making wearable technology. 160 plus manufacturers right now with spanning 24 different device categories. It's about $8.6 billion in revenue for 2012. We expect to see that grow pretty significantly. And then I'll be talking about that growth pattern in just a second. As you can see, when we start talking about 160 plus manufacturers, it's in a massive range of different areas. Fitness and wellness, infotainment, healthcare and medical, industrial and military. I'm sure there's names there that you all recognize. There's some that you probably have worked for or work for currently. It's everything from sports and fitness monitors, Bluetooth headsets, imaging products, etc. However, out of that 160, 9 manufacturers represent 55% of that market in 2012. So at this point, it's a growing market, but everybody's still trying to figure it out. And frankly, it's still pretty nascent. It's very early days yet for wearable technology. This is, again, our numbers slide. We're looking at, here's the overview for wearable tech. Here's the overview for what the world market looks like. It's one of the rare cases, and we do this a lot with emerging markets, for nascent markets, where we talk about, here's our upside, downside, and our base forecast, because frankly, it could go a couple of different ways. Best case scenario, you're looking in 2018 at just shy of $50 billion in revenue. Worst case scenario, you're looking at maybe $18 billion in revenue in 2018, which I know you're saying, well, $18 billion in revenue, I'd take that. If it was in my bank, I'd be happy with it. But the fact of the matter is, this is one of those areas where consumer acceptance is critical. You have to make a device that is aesthetically pleasing. You have to make a device that's easy to use. You have to make a device that adds value. It doesn't just duplicate what is already out there. And you have to get people comfortable with using it and with sharing the information that's going to be involved. We've already seen a lot of this with smartphones, where having that connection to the internet, that instant connection, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook or what have you, creates the potential for a lot of, I'll say, kindly embarrassment for folks, because they get excited and they post something in the heat of the moment or a couple of beers in, and then they regret it much later. Wearable tech amplifies that by a significant magnitude. The other piece to this is healthcare. If you look at healthcare growth, healthcare is a very difficult subject. You're sharing your most personal information. In a best case scenario with your healthcare provider, but also with your insurance provider. And you may not want to share all of that information in that fashion with your healthcare provider or with your significant other. So, when you start talking about the privacy issues involved with this, when you start talking about, okay, wait a minute, who exactly is going to have access to this information? It's something that we need to work out what the regulations are and what is it going to take to get people comfortable with sharing that information. One of the reasons that wearable tech is so interesting is because of the breadth of technologies that can be incorporated into it. We've highlighted a few here with MEMS technology, with Bluetooth Low Energy, and long-term evolution looking at integrating low-power displays and efficient processing into these devices. really, when you look at the family of technologies that's incorporated, you start to get a better sense of why people maybe get a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of wearable technology. You've got a GPS, you've got camera, you've got speech recognition, embedded vision, MEMS, and displays. The MEMS in and of itself can give you your position down to within a few feet or a few inches in some cases, in addition to giving you all of the positioning information and local weather and local atmospheric condition information. So this is a device that you have on you which is reporting all of this to anyone else you happen to be connected to or anyone else who's monitoring the stream. I know there's times I don't want that much information out there. So it's something that we really need to think about. How can we take this technology and use it for the greater good and use it for the good of the individual consumer? Healthcare and fitness, everybody always asks me when we talk to them about M2M or when we talk about IoT, well, healthcare should be huge. It should be a massive piece of that market. There's so many clear benefits. There's so many obvious benefits, being able to monitor people, have them in the hospital less time, have them be able to be at home recovering, have them have constant monitoring from their doctor. Sure, in theory, it's great. And we do see a lot of those drivers pushing this. The problem is, who's going to pay for it? And how's that going to be implemented? And how does that work from state to state when different states have different regulations here in the US, let alone in Europe where you have different countries with different regulations. And now you have folks that are international and you want to be able to share that information across borders. And now you want to be able to do studies with that information and you want to share that patient information across. How do you anonymize it? It becomes very, very difficult. And that's why healthcare has taken so long to take off. I'll just touch on the big data because I know we're running on time a little bit. But big data is a piece of this. There's actually a study right now with asthma inhalers where they're looking at putting sensors and connectivity into asthma inhalers. So they can look at, for a particular region, when's the asthma inhaler being used. They can aggregate that data and see, okay, is the pollen count high? Is this correlating with the humidity or the haze or the smog or the pollution in this particular city or region or area? And they can tie that in with other environmental factors. Again, you're sharing a lot of information, but there's a lot of benefit for other folks around. So, big tech in particular, or wearable tech in particular, securing the data, absolutely essential. Being able to make sure it is only shared with the folks you want to share with. And it's not an opt-out, but a true opt-in. Small, fast, and energy-efficient processors, easy to use. Those really are around just making the devices comfortable for consumers. So, Internet of Things and people. Big picture, just kind of to tie it all together as we finish off. The promise of Internet of Things is that it's going to improve your quality of life in big and small ways. The fact of the matter is, for Internet of Things to play out the way we'd like it to play out, it's going to involve sharing a lot of information. And even things done with the best of intentions can have repercussions you didn't expect. For example, again, to go back to Austin, the City of Austin Fire Department enabled helmet cameras for their firefighters. So they were wearing helmet cams into fires, and the reason they were doing it was for training exercises, so they could play the film back and say, what'd you do right, what'd you do wrong, how can we improve on this? Austin Statesman ran a few articles on this because they'd been doing it for almost a year at that point. And all of a sudden folks said, wait a minute, what? I'm being recorded in my most vulnerable moment as I'm being rescued in my nightgown from my house. I'm not sure I necessarily want somebody viewing that. And so they put a halt to the program while they reviewed where the information was being stored, how it was being viewed, and what the guidelines were going to be around that. But it's a case where, again, best of intentions need to be looking at how we implement those. So getting people comfortable with the amount of information that's available for them and looking at ways to make sure we can allow the Internet of Things as we grow it, as we build these foundation layers, how we get consumers comfortable with it and comfortable using it. So with that, I will turn it out to questions for a couple of minutes. We have a microphone here and a microphone there because they are recording this. So if you want to speak into the mic, if you do have a question, feel free.
Mary, can you talk a bit more about the business models? You were mentioning that that was one of the big barriers, and at the end of the day, technology is the easy part. It's how do you get it to the market. In 2003, I launched a program, and we got a telehealth to be paid by the insurance company in the Netherlands, and that's the way it got in, and it's still going. So maybe you can share a bit more examples of how that can make it to market.
I think we've looked at telehealth pretty extensively, and I think for insurance-provided telehealth home health hubs, the total market, I want to say, was about 2 million globally. I'll check the number for you, but it's very small. The units are expensive, and it's difficult to get insurance providers to pay for those. The workaround that they're increasingly finding is apps and smartphones and enabling it on the device, and then all they do is provide the patient with whether it's a blood glucose monitor, blood pressure monitor, or what have you, that's enabled with low-power wireless connectivity. It can connect to the smartphone, and the smartphone actually aggregates the data and then transmits it to the doctor, the insurance provider, who's monitoring the patient. So I think that's one of those where we're starting to see that shift. Originally, they were thinking, hey, having these home health hubs is going to be fantastic. Just was very difficult to implement, as I'm sure you experienced. Getting the FDA approval here in the US, very, very difficult. But you have companies like Qualcomm, who has a whole initiative just around this, who's been working aggressively at it and looking at, okay, how can we shift the paradigm a little bit, look at making it app-enabled, and then having the medical devices more as accessories almost to the smartphone. And it's easier to get approval that way. But yeah, healthcare is one of the ones where the business model is going to be very difficult to work out. Anyone else? It is, I'll do this one as last question, if that's okay. So he was asking, mostly what we focused on here is people-to-machine interface, and he was asking about how do we see the market for people-to-machine, kind of extending it the next step out. Honestly, I think it's going to get harder and harder to make those distinctions as we move forward, as we start to expand this concept of Internet of Things. And I was having a conversation just before we started, actually, with Elaine about this idea that where does control of the device lie and who has access to that device. So again, you look at something like a parking light or a parking meter, or sorry, street light or a parking meter. And you can see a very easy use case where it's pure M2M, only one controller needs to have access to that radio, that's it. You're done. So it's very easy to lock that system down and make it secure. But if you start thinking about it in a broader smart cities concept, you may actually want to have 2 or 3 individuals, whether it's city government, whether it's first responders, whether it's local business owners who want to offer incentives to their employees for carpooling, for example. So the machine to machine and machine to people and people to machine and machine to people is going to start getting really blurry over time, I think, as we start seeing this integration starts to happen and more connected devices start to appear in the ecosystem, because multiple people will be tying into those, and it's going to be about contextual awareness. When I go to a hotel room, for example, for this event, the TV will be able to talk to my smartphone and know what I want to watch. You know, it's going to bring up the latest episode of The Walking Dead that I haven't seen yet, without me having to do a lot of programming and futzing around. Same thing, it will look at my laptop and know my calendar and set my alarm so I'm up early enough to have breakfast with the folks from C-Date rather than sleeping through it. So, but we're not quite at that point yet, but I think we're getting there.
I definitely want to thank you for this. It's been absolutely wonderful. There's so many other questions. Do we have one more?
Oh, okay. One more? Okay.
Can we do? Let's, please, one more.
What initiatives are being done to improve the public relations of data sharing so people become more comfortable sharing data?
I think first we have to get over the current issues. I mean, as the news die down a little bit about the NSA before we start to figure out how we can do a PR spin campaign to make people more comfortable with it. I think the key thing is going to be highlighting the success stories. How can we talk about ways where information is shared in a responsible way for the greater good, and not focus as much on the negative. But there's some real concerns that have been raised, very, very legitimate concerns that have been raised over the last couple of months as we start to learn the extent of these programs, the extent to which tech companies were pressured to comply by governments. You know, you start looking at that, it does make you very uncomfortable with sharing that amount of information. When you look at the way, the exact same techniques, the exact same big data analytics that are being argued for in an Internet of Things standpoint to improve everyone's lives are the exact same techniques that were used to mine data, ostensibly for security and to make us all more secure, but without our conscious awareness of it, to look at the network of relationships that individuals had. And that's the danger of the technology. That's where you have to start saying, there's a great potential for good, and there's also a great potential for this to be misused. And so we need to be very cautious of that moving forward. And like I said, find a few really good cases where we can say this is a win-win here, as opposed to cases where, okay, this was clearly where bounds were overstepped. And I suspect coming out of this, there's going to be some firm regulation from governments to rein in their own activities. I'll leave a lot of that discussion for the next panel, though, because I suspect that'll be coming up shortly. Oh,
Hi, I wanted to thank you. As someone who is, after 22 years, transitioning into moving from this great state to Turkey, it's of course awesome, the top-notch presentation and what's happening in the technology. But what disturbs me is that to see, yes, we are creating, and as these tools become more common and more available, my last visit 2 weeks ago to Turkey to see even the smallest that we take for granted is seen as a luxury. And I am talking from the human factor piece, the people who need it the most, from the wheelchair to the medical especially. And it's very disturbing to see people who go through very debilitating diseases. They're at 60s, 50s, and still they don't have wheelchair or ways of even moving around. And I have seen it in Atlanta too, that also was disturbing. Any global initiatives? I know, and I'm sure there are more than I know as someone, moving from special ed to assistive technology and rehab. It is just new to me, but it just seems like there is a need not to just focus on, and I know, Georgia Tech is the top notch in producing and leadership and getting it done, but how are we going to make sure it's moving in a speed that it really can be implemented, used by people who need it the most? And another thing I learned that's very disturbing, Turkish government will pay for the services. And the industry, when I met here, contacted them, they said, we cannot get anybody pay for any devices. And that is a big problem, because without the device, how are you going to provide the service? They have to take it home. Those type of concerns, how are we going to take it from here to people who needs it? Because without people, we can't keep doing what we're doing.
It's really the crux of the problem, isn't it? And the areas where I have seen the most activity, and I'm sure some other folks can give some examples, but when you start talking about emerging markets and emerging countries, the areas where I've seen the greatest examples have been around education and, to a large extent, remote healthcare, and using technology to enable a lot of that activity. And some good work has been done in that space. Is it enough? No. Frankly, a lot of it is still centered, and the developments are still centered on Western world and figuring out how to resolve parking problems in Paris. Is that a legitimate problem for the people in Paris? Yes. Does it help the person who's dying of malaria? No. So I think we need to come at it from both ends of the spectrum, honestly, because what we learn in Paris, we'll be able to apply in a lot of those. What's interesting is, from an infrastructure standpoint, what we're hoping will happen is we're able to leapfrog a lot of the technologies, and in the emerging markets, put in best-in-class networks, best-in-class backhaul, to the extent that those can be afforded. But that will enable a much better, that will leapfrog this technology so they can implement better technologies right out of the gates and be prepared for IoT-style implementations right out of the gate, as opposed to a lot of the countries, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe, where they're having to upgrade the infrastructure and upgrade the services to even be able to take advantage of some of these. Honestly, that's what you've asked is one of the key reasons that we'll be discussing here. There are people issues involved with this. There are government issues involved with this. There are regulatory issues involved with this, where we can make the technology piece happen. We just need to figure out how do we make it happen for enough people in enough ways.
All right, well, I definitely want to thank you. I mean, we're going to have a number of sidebars over the next day and a half. I think it's an intriguing presentation, and I have a number more questions to ask even beyond that in terms of, what's the new comms protocols to maybe make it more flexible and the device discovery, et cetera. There's so many components to this. So, but thanks for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you very
and
much.
we very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.